Madam President and Senators, good morning.
Good morning.
Luke 6:31 states, "And as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them." It is important that as a nation we examine our treatment of others. Too often we only think about ourselves or persons in our group or family members. And at times that we are protected or distanced from the trials and hardships that others endure and bear. As leaders, each of you should envision where are the broken areas of our society that I can impact in a positive way. What can I do that will cause persons to feel alienated or are victims of society's ills to know that I care and want the best for them? You see, the very things that we wish and want for our children, our family, and our group, we should want for others and all people. Proverbs 3:27 states, "Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it is in your power to help them." Someone has said, sometimes we must interfere when human lives are endangered, when dignity is in jeopardy. As leaders, as you enact laws, remember there are times when leaders must determine what is required of me to be a part of needed change in my society. Do I have the courage to make unpopular and necessary right choices? When I am no longer in leadership, will I be proud of the laws and contributions that I were a part of enacting during my time of national service? And will I have contributed to correcting and eradicating broken sectors of our society? Today, as you make your Senate contributions, I want you to remember 6 things. Number 1, remember that transformative change is needed, but it is a process, and each of you must be committed to working consistently for it. 2, know that you speak for many who are unable to speak or stand up for themselves. Never take that privilege lightly. Number 3, keep focused, because flattery and criticism can both distract you from your purpose. Be wise. Number 4, know that this is your opportunity to make a real difference. Be courageous. Number 5, when you are misunderstood or misquoted, pause, regroup, and stay on point. This is your season to make a difference. Do it. And number 6, remember that you are doing for others what you would want for you. Live by the golden rule and allow it to be your guide and force in your life and service. Galatians 6:9 and 10 states, "And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone." Let us pray. Dear God, we give you thanks for the privilege to lead at every level of our society. Today, we ask you to endue our senators with wisdom, courage, and tenacity, that they will need to stay focused and do what is right for our Bahamas. Help them to surrender to your leading and not to be distracted by flattery or criticism. May they remain focused and do what is right. Preserve and protect them in all their undertakings. In the precious name of Jesus we pray.
Amen.
The Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven,
Hallowed
be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Good morning, Senators, Honorable Senators, when the business of the House was suspended on the 31st of January 2023, we were at further second reading. I presume that we are ready to start today's proceedings. Before we commence today's proceedings, we have a number of persons in the gallery whom the chair would like to recognize. Firstly, sincere gratitude is extended to the Senate chaplain for her spiritual guidance and dedication to the Senate body. We appreciate you immensely, Madam Chaplain. It is a pleasure to preside today over the long-awaited and historic Protection Against Violence Bill. Domestic violence continues to wreak havoc and fear in our communities, families, and the country as a whole, leaving behind devastating emotional, psychological, financial, and socioeconomic consequences. The Chinese proverb reminds us that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Today, we are taking a historic step in the right direction against domestic violence that plagues our capital and family islands. Accordingly, the chair expresses sincere appreciation to the dedicated and hardworking men and women for bringing the Protection Against Violence Bill into fruition. The National Task Force on Gender-Based Violence, which included Chair Ms. Ruby Nottage, Dr. Sandra Dane Patterson, Dr. Robin Roberts, the Ministry of Social Services, and by extension, the Minister and the Minister of State, the Department of Gender Affairs, the Attorney General, and the team at the Office of the Attorney General. There are many persons in the gallery today who wish to bear witness and observe today's debate. The chair extends sincere gratitude to all of you who are present. As I call your name, can you please stand? Firstly, the chair welcomes the nation's First Lady, Anne Marie Davis, who was a trailblazer for the rights of women, girls, and domestic violence. Thank you. Mrs. Cynthia Mother Pratt, Deputy Governor General, former nurse, Member of Parliament, and Deputy Prime Minister. Did you see Sandra Walker? Is Sandra Walker here? Okay. Reverend Sandra Walker, an administrator, minister of the gospel, who is an anointed and gifted woman of God, and someone both the Vice President and I are happy to call our friend. Inspector Kendra Wims. She's the officer in charge of the newly formed Domestic Violence Task Force. Barry, I didn't see Kelly's mother, so she's not here. Okay. Families of All Murdered Victims is an exceptional organization that goes above and beyond the call of duty to assist not just families of murdered victims, but also provide support to persons who have experienced violence, sexual assault, or persons who are just feeling down on a luck. Today we have with us the incomparable Candy Gibson, founder of FOAM. We also have she also as a part of FOAM, who is the co-chair, and she's in charge of the domestic violence section, we have Linnell Clark. Linnell Clark is a victim of violence, and we appreciate her presence here today and also being an advocate. Mrs. Candy Gibson specifically asks that I advise everyone that on August 11, 2023, FOAM will be hosting a back-to-school jamboree where they will provide assistance with school uniforms and supplies for murdered victims' families. From the Progressive Liberal Party Women's Branch Association, we have Patricia Ann Clare, Chairlady. Wanda Bonby, First Vice. Cecile Wallace, Third Vice. Gwyneth Reckley, Executive. Cynthia Meadows, Executive. Madeline Nesbitt, Chaplain. Tamara Knowles. Siobhan Johnson, Executive. And we also have with us today Vanessa Scott, President of the F&M's Women Association. Prodesta Moore, President of Women United. And of course, Erin Brown from Erin Brown Connect, Sewell, and Women United. Just wait for us. Johnny Isaacs Dotson, former Senator and Deputy Secretary General of the F&M. Ursula Dane, Vice Treasurer of the F&M. Cecile Scott, First Vice President of the Torchbearers Youth Association. Patricia Moxie. She serves as the president of one of our senior homes in the South. I'm just making sure I didn't miss it. Ruby Ann Darling, is she here? She's not here. Okay, good. Coming in right now. And also with us is the Progressive Liberal Party's men's branch. They are led by their chairman, Mr. Joe Johnson. Whistler DeVilma, the first vice chair. Leroy Poitier, the second vice chair. Veron Moss, secretary. Cheyenne Chipman, national general counsel. Adion Anderson, sergeant at arms. And Jamal Ladon, assistant chaplain. There are also members from the Progressive Young Liberals. They are led by their chairman, Mr. Jordan Clark. Deante Clark, vice chairman. Alyssa Storr, a member. And Fernie Ferguson, PYL. There's a special young lady today, and she's come to support her mother. We have with us Rika Seymour. She's the eldest daughter of Senator Maxine Seymour. Careful, every senators. Maxine has personal backup in the House. We also have with us today, I want to make sure I have to take this name slowly, Kara Jara Shla Glenhav. He's a youth ambassador, a Bahamian who lives in Scotland. Thank you for coming. And with him, he's brought a friend. Her name is Anne Campbell from Scotland. And this is Ms. Campbell's first trip from Scotland to any other part of the world, and she's chose to visit the Bahamas. And he also brought with him another special guest and a dear friend of his, Ambrose Smith. The chair and the Senate body, I hope I didn't miss anyone. Those that have missed, please stand. Oh, I'm that good? Excellent, 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 excellent. Oh, the 17th senator? Yes. The unofficial 17th senator, Sparky. Thank you for all of your assistance, Sparky. The chair and the Senate body appreciates your presence today, and it is our hope that you would find today's proceedings educational, informative, and rewarding. For the second reading. Wait, we didn't, you have to introduce it first. The chair recognizes Senator the Honorable Ryan Pinder.
Thank you, Madam President. Certainly I want to welcome everybody in attendance today. This is obviously a historic day here in the Senate, and one that I think we should all be proud of. It should tell you that we not only have a full gallery, but we have full attendance here as well, which I think might be one of the first times since swearing in. So I want to thank everybody for their excitement, their commitment, and their presence here today. It's very important. Madam President, good morning. Today I rise to move for the second reading of the Protection Against Violence Bill 2023. This bill is a result of a lot of hard work by government, by civil society, and by not-for-profit organizations, and has taken a long time to come to fruition. Sometimes its progress impacted by public controversy. Victims of domestic violence in our country have for too long faced harsh reality. The powers that be not always stepped up to protect them or to protect their children. An epidemic of violence has been spreading for far too long throughout our communities. Despite the best intentions of a network of NGOs, support care professionals, and activists, violence continues to plague our people. While the regulatory framework of the domestic law of the Bahamas contains no specific legislative reference or provisions to address many forms of gender-based violence, it is, however, true to say that as early as the decade of the 80s, the Bahamas began to focus its attention on the problem of the violence suffered by women as a gender group, particularly in the laws related to rape and prosecution. The concern was mirrored in the enactment of Sexual Offenses and Domestic Violence Act of 1991, which was followed by a plethora of legislation which sought to address the various forms of gender-based violence, including domestic violence, sexual harassment, physical and mental abuse, all of which are found in existing legislation. The laws which presently address gender-based violence in the Bahamas to some extent include the Constitution, the Domestic Violence Protection Orders Act, the Sexual Offenses Act, the Child Protection Act, the Trafficking Persons Prevention and Suppression Act, the Persons with Disabilities Equal Opportunities Act, the Mental Health Act, the Criminal Procedure Code, the Penal Code, and the Evidence Act. Madam President, allow me to give a historical overview of the process that spans multiple administrations to arrive at the bill that we debate here today. In July 2012, the government agreed that the Commonwealth of the Bahamas should participate in the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and Empowerment of Women, strengthening state accountability and community action for ending violence against women project. This project has been implemented in some 10 countries across the Caribbean. Its aim is to end gender-based violence through strengthened and responsive state and civil action. In July of 2013, the government of the Bahamas launched a ministerial oversight committee and national task force to oversee the development, implementation, and coordination of a national strategic plan to address gender-based violence. The mandate of the committee and task force was to define the problem, to analyze all factors involved, to generate a strategic plan of action with an intent to reduce and hopefully to eradicate gender-based violence in the Bahamas. In August of 2015, a strategic plan to address gender-based violence was prepared by the National Task Force for Gender-Based Violence. The plan was jointly delivered by Chairperson Justice Ruby Nottage and Deputy Chairpersons Dr. Sandra Dean Patterson and Dr. Robin Roberts. A gap analysis was conducted by the National Task Force for Gender-Based Violence in 2015, which involved the comparison of actual performance with potential or desired performance. The results indicated that domestic laws of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, which attempt to address gender-based violence, project a robust and confirmed approach to the eradication of gender-based violence, as they were generally fragmented, our laws, and lacking the conviction that zero tolerance of violence should reflect. First among the gaps that were identified between the actual and potential or desired performance is the complaint that there is no enabling holistic act which establishes a lead agency or authority and no intergovernmental mechanism for integrated information management. The Gender-Based Violence Task Force proposed as a remedy for this gap the Gender-Based Violence Act, which created a gender-based violence authority which would control and coordinate the goals of gender-based violence to prevent such violence. The second gap identified is that the archipelagic nature of the Bahamas presents major challenges in terms of implementation, monitoring, and enforcement of a national gender-based violence system. The third gap that was identified is that the current fragmented nature of gender-based violence-related legislation that I mentioned above leads to inefficiencies, overlapping mandates, and disaggregation of authority. The conclusion is that the above-mentioned gaps result in a weakened response to gender-based violence, which fails to adequately provide a robust response to and a thorough implementation, monitoring, and enforcement of the existing legislative provisions. Madam President, in 2016, after consultations between civil society and the government, and specifically the Minister of Social Services, a draft anti-gender-based violence bill was prepared for further consultation and refinement. Madam President, this was never intended to be a final draft. And in fact, consultations and amendments continued on the 2016 draft until today. Yes, the 2016 bill was voluminous. However, the consensus was that the bill needed work to be in a position to present to Cabinet, which would ultimately then advance it to Parliament. Madam President, I'd like to take some time to speak to these refinements to the 2016 bill that have happened over the years. Protection orders, Madam President. One area of refinement that was discussed and ultimately advanced were the provisions in the 2016 bill that addressed protection of victims and anti-gender-based violence protection orders and the repeal of the Domestic Violence Protection Orders Act 2007. In fact, in April 2017, at a meeting held by former Minister of Social Services, the Honorable Melanie Griffin, it was observed that, and I quote, "One of the potentially controversial aspects of the draft bill is its repeal of the Domestic Violence Protection Orders Act 2007 without indicating a defined replacement. Although recognizing that there were issues to address with the protection orders, I quote, repealing them without fully thought out and widely consulted replacement draft bill may have negative implications for victims who are now really beginning to use the orders consistently. We certainly wouldn't want to inhibit the tools available for domestic violence victims. It was therefore agreed we would create two separate bills, one for protection orders and another dealing with other gender-based violence matters. It was the view that the way the 2016 bill addressed protection orders was inadequate to provide for the tools necessary for victims of domestic violence. Madam President, we propose to amend the Domestic Violence Protections Order Act to include provisions for a new definition of domestic violence on the basis that in today's reality, domestic violence may include the abuse of persons who have no domestic relationship with the abuser. The essence of this recommendation is to amend the definition to prescribe that a victim as one who is personally connected to the abuser, rather than the present description of the relationship of the victim as a spouse, partner, child, or any other person who is a member of the household or a dependent, broadening the scope of protection orders in the context of domestic violence. The stated reason for recommended change is that the proposed definition captures all forms of relationships and ensures that all victims of domestic abuse are sufficiently covered. Madam President, on the topic of gender-based, as you would know, the name of this bill is the Protection Against Violence Bill. The 2016 bill applies to gender-based violence. Gender-based violence in the 2016 bill, and I quote, means any physical, economic, or financial, emotional, verbal, or psychological abuse against a person because of the person's gender or gender identification, whether or not constituting a criminal offense. The 2016 bill speaks entirely and exclusively to gender-based violence matters. It is our position, and that of esteemed professionals, that a regime focused only on gender-based violence has the potential to be confusing, and a broader application to violence is more appropriate. Madam President, I think it appropriate to mention that the suggestion to broaden the scope of the current bill to violence generally was done on the recommendation from the Crisis Center and the Department of Gender Affairs. Madam President, there are esteemed experts that also weigh in on the issue between narrowing a regime to just gender-based violence or applying a regime to broader violence generally. Sophie Reed Hamilton, an independent consultant with 20 years' experience of working on issues of children's and women's rights, authored an article in the periodical named The Humanitarian Exchange. That article was entitled Gender-Based Violence, a Confused and Contested Term. The article speaks to the evolution of gender-based violence and the differing interpretations that have developed with respect to those words. I will table the article today. I have it here, so the public can have a read of the entire article. However, I want to quote one section that sums up the developing consensus on this issue. And I quote, "Why does it matter that humanitarian agencies and workers have multiple different shifting and sometimes even conflicting perspectives on what is and is not gender-based violence, and therefore what should and should not constitute humanitarian response to it? Divergent views and perspectives could lead to healthy and rigorous debate and to more appropriate and more effective humanitarian response. However, lumping all forms of gendered and sexualized violence together under a violence against women and girls framework without a sound understanding and explanation of the causes, drivers, and impacts of such violence on individuals, families, and communities is potentially harmful. A broad definition of gender-based violence that is not clearly grounded in sound analysis and does not draw on expertise and experience will lead to poor practice and potentially to ineffective interventions. We want to ensure that we are passing legislation on violence that is appropriate and avoids the possibility of confusion. We want to ensure that the desire of the Crisis Center in advocating for children and the Department of Gender Affairs in their concern that isolating a bill to gender-based violence will cause confusion as to only applicability to women are taken into account. And thus we propose the Protection Against Violence bill. Yes, this is a shift from the 2016 bill, and we admit that. We admit that. But a shift that is supported in policy and supported in expert analysis.
Say that part again. You need to understand that. Say it again. Say it again. Please.
This is a shift
Yes,
from the 2016 bill.
sir.
We recognize it.
Yep,
We recognize it.
yep.
However, this shift is supported in policy and expert analysis. The 2016 bill, Madam President, also created the Department of Family and Gender Affairs. This part of the bill is no longer needed. In November of 2006, Minister of Social Services and Community Development, the Honorable Melanie Griffin, announced that the Bureau of Women's Affairs has been expanded into a Department of Gender and Family Affairs in order to ensure a more comprehensive, participatory approach to tackling the country's social challenges while creating programs to address education, training, employment, and social justice for both men and women. This part of the 2016 bill, thus, is no longer necessary. With respect to criminal offenses, Madam President, the 2016 bill provided for separate criminal offenses that constitute acts of physical abuse and gender-based violence. I noted earlier that there are a variety of laws in place that address offenses related to violence and gender-based violence. Having a separate list in the 2016 bill was regarded as inconsistent with current law and would provide an opportunity for confusion on applicable law, offenses, and penalties. It was determined that these offenses should be removed and we should rely on the offenses in existing criminal law. Madam President, with respect to tax concessions, the 2016 bill provides for a registration of Gender-Based Violence Support Service Providers, which effectively is a registration of the not-for-profit institutions involved in supporting victims of gender-based violence. The current bill has a similar registration. The primary benefit in the 2016 bill for these not-for-profits is for the ability to apply to the Ministry of Finance for certain tax concessions. We all agree, I don't think there's ever been a dispute, that these not-for-profits involved in such a fundamental societal function should have access to tax concessions. However, it should not be as in the 2016 bill, as there are other mechanisms already established with our revenue collecting departments to facilitate tax concessions to not-for-profits generally. Both the Department of Inland Revenue and the Customs Department already have established protocols and procedures in place for not-for-profits to request tax exemptions on all forms of taxes that they administer. Through my own personal experience, the process is very efficient, and the Ministry of Finance and its departments are very generous in awarding tax concessions to not-for-profits. In fact, the not-for-profit that I'm affiliated with has never been denied by either administration for tax concessions for their charitable activities. And I'm sure my good colleague could speak to that issue. It was our view that having duplicative provisions in legislation can lead to inconsistencies and confusion. And we rely on the generosity of the Ministry of Finance in providing the concessions to not-for-profits. Madam President, I provide this review of the 2016 bill to provide context in the journey to arriving at the bill that we debate today. Providing a comprehensive explanation is our obligation, especially to those organizations and institutions who have worked tirelessly over the many of years to contribute not only to the legislative process, but to the support of our society in these gender-based violence and domestic violence matters. We believe the foundational protection areas that are found in the 2016 bill are proper. And we believe that the Protection Against Violence bill reflects these. Madam President, at the April 2017 meeting held by former Minister of Social Services, the Honorable Melanie Griffin, the one that I referenced prior, concluded with a recommendation as to the draft of the 2016 anti-gender-based violence bill. There's a definitive recommendation provided. And I quote, "It was recommended that the draft be further revised with a view to narrowing the focus and prioritizing the creation of institutions and mechanisms for gender-based violence prevention and response. Specifically, the group agreed that this bill should focus exclusively on establishing the Gender-Based Violence Authority and its institutions." This is back in 2017. It was agreed that reference to further revision to the law, which we are on the record as being open to, it was agreed that reference to further revision to the law, to policy, and other matters could be thoroughly addressed upon the establishment of the authority. The Protection of Violence Against Violence Bill 2023 does just what is recommended by this group, headed by the former Minister of Social Services, who we know put tireless work into the development of this framework. So we believe that the Protection Against Violence Bill 2023 fulfills the mandate before us. Madam President, the general objectives of the Protection Against Violence Bill 2023 are to, 1, provide a national strategy to prevent and respond to violence by promoting a multidisciplinary approach to community and services to assist victims and manage offenders. The second general objective is to provide for a system of information gathering to generate reliable statistics on violence against women which result in death. And thirdly, compliance with regional and international human rights treaty obligations. Madam President, the Protection Against Violence Bill 2023 allows for the establishment of the Protection Against Violence Commission, which will work with the responsible minister to ensure that victims are treated with compassion and dignity and have access to justice without unnecessary delays and impediments. The work of the Commission will inform policies, promote awareness of human rights, allocate resources for specialized services, promote education and sensitivity training, and promote programs and policies that are gender sensitive, equitable, and lead towards greater gender equality and improved gender relations. The Commission will not only advise on policies, it will also oversee the implementation of a national strategic plan for combating and responding to violence. The Commission will serve as the gathering point for collaboration and coordination of all stakeholders who work to combat and respond to violence. The Commission will also keep the government abreast of the need to maintain an adequate number of shelters. The Commission is also responsible for establishing a federation of community organizations against violence to act as an apex body of support services to victims. The vehicle that will bring together the various NGOs and other community organizers and ensure that their input plays a major role in the Commission's work. Madam President, this isn't a passive commission that is intended to sit by. This is intended to be an active commission, one designed to provide results for the benefit of all who are victims of violence. The Commission is comprised of representatives from the Ministry of Health, local government, education, science and technology, the Attorney General's Office and Legal Affairs, Youth, Sports and Culture, as well as Department of Social Services, the Commission, its foundation, and divisional heads, as well as 3 other appointed stakeholders with active involvement in these issues. The composition of the Commission is substantially the same as the composition of the Gender-Based Violence Authority found in the 2016 bill. Madam President, the bill also allows for the establishment of the Protection Against Violence Foundation, which will be used to raise funds to support the Commission and the activities related to the Commission. It is important to note that the funds of the foundation can never be used for the personal benefit of any directors, officers, or private persons. And in fact, we look to structure this foundation, Madam President, in a way where it will also qualify for international tax exemptions for donations. Because as we know, we are a small society with a big problem. And we need to broaden our horizon to raise resources. And so we will make this foundation a qualifying 501c3 organization in the United States in order to be able to solicit the funds necessary at a multinational level to be able to tackle one of the greatest issues that we face today,
real change.
Violence
Real change.
against our people.
Progressive.
Madam President, the Commission will have a technical body called the Protection Against Violence Secretariat, which will coordinate, formulate, publish, and implement protocols and procedures, manage applications for funding and assistance, as well as oversee negotiations with regional and international bodies and assist the Commission with the matters of importance. The Secretariat will be the technical day-to-day arm of the Commission to fulfill the goals and mandate that are set for it. Madam President, noted in the draft bill are the binding principles to which the Protection Against Violence Commission must adhere to in carrying out its functions. These binding principles align with the CEDAW treaties and the Bellum do Para and prescribe that the victims are treated with an enhanced level of compassion and respect and are able to access prompt justice and redress through strengthened judicial and administrative mechanisms. The Commission will engage legal services to assist with complaints, liaise with police investigators to ensure that they are upholding their obligations, and provide legal guidance as necessary throughout the process. The legal element will play an even more important role with the introduction of a slate of protected rights under this bill. There will be a right to be treated with compassion and dignity, which means that every victim of violence has the right to be treated with compassion and dignity by every person who comes into contact with them in a professional capacity. That's very vital. Victims, as we know, are very fragile. And there's no reason you could imagine that you should not extend the appropriate level of dignity when counseling or assisting a victim of violence. The victim will have the right of confidentiality from all people who provide any kind of relevant service to support them, including members of the Commission itself and persons acting on behalf of the Commission. That confidentiality will apply to the identity, the offender's identity, the identity of witnesses, and circumstances of the offense. This, again, is a vital element. Trust is such a critical element in empowering survivors of violence and encouraging others to step up. Through the establishment of these rights, we are taking the necessary steps to protect all parties involved. Madam President, a major element of this bill is focused on procedures for the making and handling of complaints, which allows those directly impacted by violence, as well as those with information about an act of violence, to make a formal complaint. Without a formal complaint, our law enforcement officers cannot respond. A complaint is required, but very frequently, as we know, victims have a fear of making a complaint. And so this is the basis of, one, confidentiality, treating the victim with dignity, and having a prescribed framework in which law enforcement officers may have to act in order to process a complaint and assist the victim. Any formal complaint will be made in person to a police officer, which will be signed and dated inclusive of all relevant details. Police officers will be required by law to investigate all such complaints, and in the course of that investigation will be expected to assist the victim with obtaining treatment, getting to a safe place, accompanying the victim to remove any personal belongings that they may need to get, informing the victim of necessary details and procedures that they may have to follow, including the importance of preserving and collecting evidence, and connecting them with the Protection Against Violence Commission to provide the support needed after the complaint, which again, as I referenced, could include legal support. Madam President, the Protection Against Violence Bill has provisions speaking to specifically to sexual violence and abuse and expected related care and support services. The Commission will be obligated to provide safe housing and shelter for women who are victims of sexual violence and any accompanying children. The Commission will make any necessary accommodations for the arrangement of psychological, medical, and legal assistance. And we know the psychological and mental care might be the most important form of assistance to be able to be provided after an event of violence. We would have passed, Madam President, earlier this year, the new Mental Health Act, which is intended to support and bring in mental health assistance into a modern regime benchmarked against international best practices. That piece of legislation will underlie the obligation that exists here to assist victims with psychological assistance. There is also an obligation to provide safe places for victims in addition to age-appropriate counseling, group sessions, and alternative means of resolution and restorative justice. It was very important for the bill to directly support victims of sexual violence as a group that specifically requires support that is not always available in the way it needs to be. Victims of violence are not a standard form of support. Every individual person will require, undoubtedly, a unique and particular form of support. Whether that be care, mental health assistance, legal assistance, physical health assistance. The framework is there to customize and provide unique care to victims of violence. We are providing for these specific needs in this bill. In instances when violence results in death, the Violent Fatality Review Team, comprised of a retired Supreme Court Justice and representatives from social services, public health, and the Public Health Authority, in addition to 2 other appointees recommended by the Commission, will make recommendations to the Minister regarding potential legal changes based on their research and their review of closed cases. This is important. You could only effectively make change going forward if you understand the basis for the issues from a historical context. And that's why data collection and analysis is fundamental, especially in circumstances where violence results in death. The objective of this team is not to respond to individual cases, but to take a big picture view of the situation and provide recommendations to respond to identified trends in ways that are likely to directly address any emerging contributory issues through legislative and policy change or specific initiatives or actions. So this team will not only advise the government on any legislative and policy reform, but also advise the Commission with respect to any specific initiative that they are undertaking that likewise has to be reformed in real time. Madam President, this is the framework of the Protection Against Violence Bill 2023. Fulfilling the recommendations as set out in 2017, narrowing the focus and prioritizing the creation of institutions and mechanisms for gender-based violence prevention and response. Specifically, the recommendation was that the bill should focus exclusively on establishing the Gender-Based Violence Authority and its related institutions. It was agreed that reference to further revision of the law, policy, and other matters could be thoroughly addressed on the establishment of the authority. Again, providing expert advice to the government through the authority to make further reforms. This isn't a closed book. Society changes. The needs of our people change. And the willingness to have flexibility in adjusting legislation and policy on an ongoing basis to reflect those changes is what is intended.
It happens every day. Legislation is amended.
Madam President, the work on the legislative framework is not the only aspect to close the gaps with respect to gender-based violence and violence in general. Earlier, I noted in the discussion of the 2015 gap analysis, the second gap was that the archipelagic nature of the Bahamas presents major challenges in terms of implementation, monitoring, and enforcement of a national gender-based violence system. We have been working hard to address this issue. And when I say we, I mean the collective we, because this isn't a political issue.
Shouldn't politicize it either.
The government continues its efforts to implement the National Strategic Plan to address gender-based violence, with the most recent achievement being the implementation of the Family Island Coordination Councils to address gender-based violence. This is in response to that second gap in the gap analysis that spoke about the challenges of our archipelagic country. The purpose of the councils are to focus on community-based partnerships throughout our country. Partnerships to prevent gender-based violence in our Family Island communities and to ensure that the victims of gender-based violence receive professional support and clinical services needed to recover from their situations. Us island boys know that we have limited support in our settlements. That is a fact of the country in which we live. It's not an indictment on anybody. It is a fact. And the further away from the capital, the more challenges you have in getting support services. That's why these councils are fundamental in our archipelagic nation to support victims of gender-based violence. These councils represent a multi-sectoral, coordinated approach to achieving an effective and integrated response to gender-based violence while assisting in the rehabilitation of the perpetrators of abuse. This is complemented by the efforts of the Men's Desk in building support for the prevention of gender-based violence against women. The Urban Renewal Task Force Relief Unit also conducts door-to-door home visits to residents experiencing conflict or abusive relationships to problem solve and prevent the escalation of violence in our community. The 10 urban renewal centers throughout the country are mandated to report all incidents of gender-based violence to the Relief Task Force Unit. The Department of Social Services provides temporary shelter for survivors of gender-based violence, providing on-site counseling and accompaniment as necessary to court. Madam President, we continue to take a holistic approach to violence, and particularly gender-based violence. A comprehensive approach is required, one, that this government, and I believe all governments, but particularly I speak for this government, are committed to. The Protection Against Violence Bill 2023 is a comprehensive legislation designed to provide protection and support for victims of violence in the Bahamas. The bill not only seeks to uphold the nation's commitments under international conventions, such as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment, and Eradication of Violence Against Women, but also creates a domestic framework for supporting victims, handling complaints, and raising public awareness to violence in our society. This bill is not about imposing new bureaucratic structures, but about improving response mechanisms, better coordinating efforts, and providing much-needed support to those who need it most, the victims of violence. It is an investment in the safety, the dignity, and the well-being of our citizens. That's what this bill is. Overall, the Protection Against Violence Bill is a testament to the Bahamas' dedication to eradicating violence against women, ensuring victim support, and promoting public education about this pressing issue. After the passage of this bill, Madam President, we will need to make a tremendous effort to generate and allocate resources as needed, to holding training sessions, and to updating our systems and processes, not only throughout government, but throughout the country, in order to meet our goals. These are important goals. These are goals that lift up a society and provide dignity and safety to our people. That's what this is intended to do. And this is what this government is committed to do. So, Madam President, I thank you for the extended period of time. I felt a comprehensive approach to this communication was required. Thank you for your indulgence. I now move for the second reading of the Protection Against Violence Violence Bill 2023. Thank you, Madam President.
Good job. Great.
Thank you, Senator Honorable Ryan Pinder, for your contribution. Is there a seconder? The chair recognizes Senator the Honorable James Roll Turner.
President, thank you. It's a wonderful time. It's a good time in our country, and I see, just before I get started here, Madam President, let me say that as I rise to second this bill of Protection Against Violence 2023, it is good to see all of our senators here. I always encourage them by wishing them the very best, because there are sometimes, I know, when we leave this place, we don't feel that we've been wished the very best. But I know that we always wish one another the very best. The truth is, because we love this country, whether we say thee or the, we mean the same thing. We care for this land and we care for this people. And sometimes it leads us down a contentious road. But at the end of the day, the records would reflect that we always cast our vote appropriately. And then when I look at the audience here, you know, I see Madam Ruby Ann Darling coming in. And when I saw you, I whispered to Senator Russell, I said, is that her or her daughter? Because I must tell you, I continue to be amazed that Bahamian women, Caribbean women, it reaches a point where they do not age. I saw Senator Maxine, I know they misled us and told us that was your daughter. Because when I looked at her a couple of times and they could pass for sisters. So I must say, oh my goodness, it must be something in the water in the Bahamas. And then all of you, you know, sometimes a ship is not balanced because it carries all of the weight on one side. And any of us that are associated with Marine would tell you that when all of the weight is on one side, some strange things happen. But I see this room is filled and I see this room is well balanced. And that is why this country is well cared for. So this morning, I am pleased at what I see. I also ought to declare, I also ought to declare that even coming out of Grand Bahama, every weekend, almost every night, you hear of someone that passed away. And last night was no exception. You get calls late at night telling you that someone else is gone. And for some reason, I just cannot get used to this type of loss. Every time someone passes away, we gotta express our sympathy and express our condolences. But the good news is, though, that even over this past weekend, at least there was one wedding. And you would know that weddings and funerals always evoke some emotions in people. I don't know if it's good, bad, or indifferent, but they certainly evoke some emotions. But every time there is a good wedding and a good union, we all celebrate and we all rejoice in that. So for the couple that got married this weekend, I say to them once again, congratulations. Because I'd always rather attend a wedding than attend a funeral.
That's right.
Weddings and funerals are known to cause certain emotional sentiments, but I ought to tell you that this Protection Against Violence Bill 2023 appears to also have certain emotionally charged energy affixed to it, because we all care about what happens here. If I were to blatantly declare to you, Madam President, my feelings on violence against women and children, I suppose I would have to use Bahamian colloquialism. And I suspect that many of my colleagues would declare that my language associated with my disgust would probably be unparliamentary. So I shall refrain from that. But this is because such matters of violence need not only parliamentary legislation, but we as guardians and protectors of an often more delicate and gentler vessel need to express our outrage at the slightest appearance of such acts, be it perpetrated against women, men, adolescents, or even children. Sometimes as I reflect on our debates, Madam President, I am reminded of who I am and whose I am. I stand here and I am a father of 2 daughters, the grandfather of 3 children, a cousin of many siblings, a brother of 2, a son, the uncle of 3 girls, the friend of many others, and one who espouses Christian principles. So if there be any who expect me to sit idly by and tolerate violence against women or children, or even fellow men, then they are very likely grossly misled, if that's an expectation at any time. But I will come back to this at a specific time. Today, we're here to talk about something that also evokes deep emotional feelings when we discuss it. Today, we are debating the Protection Against Violence Bill. As I get started here, some time ago I realized something when we began these sessions here at the Senate. There are many persons that tune in, but I've discovered that they tune in at different times for certain speakers. And I discovered in Grand Bahama, very rarely do they listen to the entire session. And I discovered that because sometimes I listen to their comments. I see what they write. And I say, where did you get that from? But they picked out portions of things. Because of this, for those who may be listening at certain times, I want to share, Madam President, with you exactly what the objects and reasons for this bill are, because there is some debate and banter in the public now about what is supposed to happen, what should have happened, what could have happened. But I want to be clear on what is happening and what is proposed and what we are advancing. The objects and reasons. The Protection Against Violence Bill 2023 seeks generally to provide for the protection of and support for victims of violence. This bill also seeks to fulfill the various obligations of the Bahamas under the Convention of the Elimination of Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Further, it seeks to promote the education and training of all those involved in the administration of justice, policing, and other law enforcement officers, as well as other personnel responsible for implementing policies for the prevention, punishment, and eradication of violence, especially against women. Further, Madam, it seeks to provide appropriate specialized services for women who have been subjected to violence through public and private sector agencies, including shelters, counseling, counseling services for all family members where appropriate, and care and custody of affected children. And I just want to pause there because while we have had many discussions prior to coming here about this, even this morning, I spoke with a friend, and she shared her point of view about how we implement and what should happen. And we agreed, because the document that is before us lays out a process of how things should be done. You know, there are many persons who believe that they're sensitive in certain situations, but the reality is they're not, because they've not been trained to be sensitive. This bit of legislation tells us that there ought to be specific training, specific elements of sensitivity associated with this. The bill also goes on to promote and support government and private sector education designed to raise the awareness of the public with respect to the problems and the remedies for violence against women. Part 2 of the bill seeks to set out the responsibility of the Commission to ensure international and regional obligations of the country are complied with, and enumerates the binding principles for which the Commission is required to adhere to. And that is very specific. Part 3 of the bill seeks to provide the framework for the administration of the Act. Specifically, the Minister has several responsibilities, and they are namely, firstly, to develop and implement a national strategic plan. It goes on to strengthen the institutional capacity in response to violence. In addition, to establish a non-profit foundation to raise funds for the sole use and benefit of the Commission in its functions. And concludes with implementing programs to provide sensitivity training for members of the police force and support service personnel, and generally raise the awareness of the public on problems and remedies of violence. Specific assignments associated with the Minister. Part 4 of the bill establishes and expressly states the general rights of victims of violence, which include the right to be treated with compassion and dignity by every person who comes into contact with them. When these acts happen, many persons are very vulnerable. You ought to be very sensitive when you're dealing with these things. It goes on to tell us about the right to be informed of all rights and services available to them under Part 6 of the Act. And that has to be an organized process. It cannot be, well, you made this, you made that. No. The Act tells them specifically what ought to be declared. The right to confidentiality by any person acting in their capacity to provide care or support services. Now listen, I know in Nassau you folks are very sophisticated. You probably don't know half of the people in Nassau. But in Grand Bahama, Abaco, and many of the islands, everyone knows everyone. So confidentiality is important, very important. There are some people who may not step forward if they feel that there's going to be some public exposition of what has happened to them. But this act tells us that they've got a right to privacy, which will be enforced. Part 5 of the bill seeks to set out the procedure for making and handling of complaints by victims and the various requirements of an investigating officer. And that is important, because, everyone knows when these things happen, sometimes there's just an inclination to run to the police, and you don't know which officer you will meet there. So there ought to be an organized process to know the way we are treating these victims, and this bit of legislation helps us with that. Part 6 of the bill demonstrates that the government's commitment in protecting women as the predominant victims of sexual abuse, and outlines the care and support services available to such victims. And these are namely, we speak about it all the time here, safe housing and shelter for victims and their accompanying children. The AG spoke earlier about psychological help, and that's important. Medical care, legal assistance, because often when these things happen, psychological care and legal assistance are not usually at the forefront. It speaks of access to safe spaces and community. It speaks of readjustment and training programs to enable victims of sexual abuse to readjust and fully participate in public and private life. And that is important, because when you are a victim of violence, it's much like being depressed. In our society, sometimes they say, oh, shake it off. Get out of it. You could get out of the fog. When there is depression, it requires clinical treatment. When a victim of violence, when violence has been perpetrated against a victim, it requires special treatment. Readjusting requires special treatment. And this bill takes us through the path that shows us that the government has an organized process with its private partners to ensure that people are assimilated back into the community in an appropriate fashion. Part 7 of the bill establishes a protocol to be followed when violence results in death. A fatality review team is empowered to review closed cases of deaths and make recommendations to the minister. The work of the review team will enable the Commission to accurately report on the rate of femicide in our country. And that's important because we have to know what's going on. This bill deals with many parts of matters associated with violence against persons, but certainly comprehensively violence against women and children. It is therefore my opinion that nothing is really lost here. But I always remind folks, if we seek perfection, we ought to be reminded that perfection is only in Jesus Christ. If there is a need to amend or adjust in the future as time changes, certainly it can be done. But there ought to be no further delay in justice and support at this time. Central in this bill, it proposes and defines a comprehensive set of rights for victims, including the rights of dignity, confidentiality, compassion, and privacy. All matters that are very sensitive at a very vulnerable time of any victim of violence, especially our women and children. I am satisfied to see a guided set of rules to ensure appropriate protocols are followed when managing these sensitive issues, often even emotionally disturbing matters and delicate situations. Even in this upper house, we have been reminded on several occasions of our commitment to safe housing, legal aid, medical assistance, and appropriate training all around. And this bill continues to outline advancements of each of those areas systematically, because it's one thing to be speaking about it and wishing it, but you have to have an organized program to advance it. Putting the theatrics of politics aside, surely one must acknowledge that the Protection Against Violence Bill puts on display our country's commitment to eradicating violence against women and ensuring appropriate victim support.
Yes.
I see in what has been presented a very promising, respectful, caring, responsive, and safer country with this bill. I don't often speak about specific offices when I speak in here, but today I want to make mention of the Attorney General's office and his pupils, the Minister of Social Services and his team, and those who have independently provided support and advice here, and their associates, who also ought to be commended for the attention to this sensitive area of our society. I also ought to declare that I am well aware of the consultations that took place here. This has led to ensuring that we meet our international obligations, ensuring clearly defined rights of victims, establishing the commission whose purpose is to focus on these elements, providing support services and guidelines. Because I will tell you, if it were left to many persons, psychological assistance would probably be way down on the list. These are not easy matters to deal with, but they have been adequately dealt with by the competent and sensitive teams and government administrators, and for that, our nation ought to be grateful. Madam President, I realized that there are those who desire separate language. But separation is not required for equality or justice. It is always better to cover the broad and all-inclusive basis. Women, children, men are all affected here. Madam President, we cannot legislate morality and good manners, but with every opportunity to shape a morally sound and compassionate society, we must put in place a framework that tells all where our moral compass is or ought to be. For far too long, people have suffered the indignity associated with acts of certain violence. This bill does not leave much to imagination because it describes acts of violence. Because of behavior Behavior of any sort that results in physical, sexual, or psychological violence, including rape, sexual abuse, torture, trafficking in persons, forced prostitution, kidnapping, sexual harassment, online harassment, or economic or financial abuse that occurs within a domestic relationship, whether or not the offender share the same household, or is even perpetrated by any person in the workplace. These things are all covered. We are now moving to an era where there is greater protection and respect for all victims of violence. There are some things that governments cannot do, and as such, there are times when a relative, the church, civil society must also play a role. Protecting against violence should be all of our business. Madam President, there is usually no reason to celebrate doing the right thing because it is a moral obligation by all of us to do so. But when the right thing is done, all good and decent persons should be counted as having supported the effort. As such, Madam President, I stand here seconding and in full support of the Protection Against Violence Bill 2023. Thank you.
It has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read for a second time and committed. A bill for an act to provide for the protection of and support for victims of violence, to establish the Protection Against Violence Commission, to enable the Bahamas to fulfill certain obligations arising under regional and international treaties and for matters connected therewith. As many Before the chair recognizes Senator Barnett Ellis, I just want to recognize the presence of Ruby Ann Dowling in the gallery, former senator, member of parliament, teacher, musician, now Her Excellency, Ambassador for Women Affairs. Thank you for coming. Yeah, the chair also wishes to recognize Attorney Bertha Cooper-Rousseau. I saw her slip in. A noted attorney and an international arbitrator. We thank you so much for coming and being here with us today. The chair recognizes Senator the Honorable Michaela Barnett Ellis.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, it is an absolute pleasure to have a full gallery today. This is the upper chamber of the People's Parliament. And whenever the people of the Bahamas take their time out of their busy schedule to attend this place, it is always a wonderful occasion. Thank you all for coming. Madam President, the equal rights and protection of women has been an ongoing discussion in the Bahamas for many, many years. There is an ongoing push and pull between revering women who gave birth to us, and we claim that they are the backbone of our communities. Yet there is increasing violence against women as they are also seen as objects to be possessed, controlled, and dominated. How many times have we been told, "That's mine," as a justification for rape? And how many times has the word submit been used in a way that was not the way God intended? It is the need for control and domination that often drives domestic violence. Having an intimate relationship with another person or simply living in the same house as another person creates an intimacy and a vulnerability that is not found in other relationships. Very often, when we are providing assistance to victims of domestic violence, it's not simply just a matter of reporting the matter and getting the person away from the perpetrator, but it is also helping that victim to find food and shelter and resources to exist without being dependent on the perpetrator. Starting over is never easy. It is the fear of starting over that often paralyzes the victim and makes the decision appear to be impossible. I had the courage to leave a bad situation, and every year I provide support and encouragement to countless men and women in my law practice who want to leave bad relationships. There are things that we, as the legislative branch of government, can do to support victims of domestic violence. We must educate the public that domestic violence is not just physical violence, but it's harassment, stalking, persistent verbal abuse. They're also forms of domestic violence. We must pass the necessary amendments to the Sexual Offenses Act so that there are no exceptions as a result of marital status. We can also bring our ancient divorce laws up to date, and we can pass legislation that provides real and meaningful support to victims of domestic violence. Domestic violence is what happens in the confines of a domestic relationship, not just family members related by blood, but also romantic relationships or people who live in the same house. The Protection Against Violence Bill is aimed at protecting victims of domestic violence. Domestic violence is different than gender-based violence. Gender-based violence is violence against women because they are women, both inside and outside of the home, at work, or in any other environment. Given that domestic violence and gender-based violence are two different things, it is amazing that this administration would suggest that the concerns about this bill are just a matter of nomenclature. Although it appears today that they have seen the light and are willing to admit that there are two different bills that deal with two different matters, or that the Protection Against Violence Bill covers a wider range of violence, or that we could just amend the Protection Against Violence Bill to provide additional gender-based violence coverage. It demonstrates that this administration does not truly understand the issue at hand. And if they consulted with the stakeholders, they would have in fact grasped a firmer understanding. Consultation is not one meeting with 5 days' notice after the bill has been tabled. This administration knows what consultation is. They have a senior jurist that considered and opined on the need for consultation in a leading case right there in law reform. Dame Anita Allen, in the Responsible Development of Abaco case in 2011, said, "Consultation is a vital ingredient of transparency in good government. It's right that public authorities inform and consult those who are affected by their decisions. Proper consultation must be undertaken at a time when proposals are still in the formative stage and must include sufficient reasons for particular proposals to allow those consulted to give intelligent consideration and intelligent response. Adequate time must be given for the purpose and product of consultation. The product of consultation must be taken into account when the ultimate decision is taken. Meeting stakeholders after a bill has been tabled is not consultation at the formative stage. Meeting with stakeholders without providing a copy of the bill is not consultation. Meeting with stakeholders after a bill has passed in the House of Assembly on the day in which it is scheduled to be debated in the Senate is not consultation. And promising to meet with them to discuss their terms in detail, but proceeding with the final stages of passing the bill in this place, in the honorable upper chamber, is disingenuous. In my view, It appears as if the minister has no real intention to consider their recommendations. It has not even been articulated, well, sort of until today, as to why the administration decided to abandon 10 years of work. But bless their heart, they have finally proffered an explanation. Could not be found. Madam President, I ask for your protection from my fellow members here.
Order. Senators, order. Please allow the senator to continue uninterrupted. Thank you, senators. Thank you, senators.
They have finally proffered an explanation. Too bad that explanation could not be found when this matter was debated in the lower chambers. But in July 2022, when I attended the Train the Trainer workshop at the Office of the Attorney General, and this is a workshop that was led by the Attorney General, it was this 2022 version of the gender-based violence bill that was discussed. So we are still at a loss as to the development of the Protection Against Violence bill. So, for example, the gender-based violence bill and the Protection Against Violence bill address two different types of violence. In fact, contrary to the assertions made, gender-based violence can include domestic violence. But domestic violence does not cover all gender-based violence. It is limited to violence that occurs in domestic relationships. For example, a woman on her morning run who is sexually assaulted by a stranger, or a woman who is raped in her home by a stranger, or a little boy who is kidnapped and sexually assaulted by a stranger, are all acts of gender-based violence, but are not acts of domestic violence. Shouldn't these persons be entitled to the psychological, medical, and legal assistance that is set out in the Protection Against Violence bill? But they are not covered by the definition of violence in this bill. Gender-based violence is defined in the Gender-Based Violence bill as any physical, economic, financial, emotional, verbal, psychological, or sexual abuse against a person because of a person's gender, whether or not constituting a criminal offense. In the Protection Against Violence bill, violence is described as any sort that results in physical, sexual, or psychological violence, including rape, sexual abuse, torture, trafficking of persons, forced prostitution, kidnapping, sexual harassment, online harassment, or economic or financial abuse. And here is the limiting factor: that occurs within a domestic relationship. The acts of violence defined in the Protection Against Violence bill are limited by occurs within a domestic relationship. A domestic, we could read B.
Misleading.
B, or perpetrated by another person, whether in the workplace or otherwise. It is limited. The Protection Against Violence bill does not include victims of acts of violence by a stranger. I repeat the example I gave on Monday. If the 9-year-old girl that was sexually assaulted on the weekend was assaulted by a stranger, she would not be entitled to the protection under the Protection Against Violence bill, but she would have been entitled to the protections under the Gender-Based Violence bill. The second and equally vexing deficiency of the Protection Against Violence bill is the vesting of additional power in the minister. In the Gender-Based Violence bill, it created a federation of community organizations against gender-based violence. The functions of the Federation are set out in Section 26 of the Gender-Based Violence Bill. They include coordinating and promoting the registration of organizations as gender-based violence support providers, and monitoring and regulating and encouraging gender-based violence work. The Gender-Based Violence Bill also established a statutory entity called the Gender-Based Violence Authority, which would, amongst other things, establish a national network of gender-based violence shelters and monitor and oversee the operations of those shelters. There would also be created a gender-based violence protection and awareness division that would be the administrative arm of the authority. The Protection Against Violence Bill, on the other hand, creates a Protection Against Violence Commission, which operates at the direction of the minister. Why is this cabinet so determined to maintain control on the provision of relief so that everybody must come to them like a pauper with a bowl looking for a handout? We have seen it in the catastrophic health plan. You have to plead your case to the Minister of Health, who will decide if you can get help or not. The Minister of Finance won't even let the police buy their own dog food or water. And no, victims of direct domestic violence must rely on the minister to decide what the appropriate care and support services are for persons subjected to domestic violence. I understand politics, and I understand the view that in order to be re-elected, you need to be seen as having the power to save and grant relief to the electorate. And maybe this is how the arrogant politician is created. But the vexing issue of gender-based violence and the increase of gender-based violence, particularly outside of domestic relationships, needs a non-political and non-governmental approach. NGOs are made up of people who have chosen to dedicate their life's work to the eradication of violence, and particularly violence against women and children. They are not cabinet ministers. They are not elected by popular vote or removed by popular vote. They are not persons who are there for a 5-year cycle. Governments cannot do it all. Isn't that why this administration has relied on public-private partnerships for almost every major infrastructure project, the details of which still remain the best-kept secret? The fight against violence against women and girls should be a public-private partnership. I support legislation that makes the lives of people who call this increasingly hot but beautiful country better. The Protection Against Violence Bill should really be called the Protection Against Domestic Violence Bill. It enshrines in statute some of the basic relief needed by victims of domestic violence. And to that end, I support this legislation. But the right to be treated with compassion, and dignity, we are born with that right, along with the rights to be informed and the right to confidentiality and privacy. It is sickening that we have to directly express these rights because there are people who are not treating people, not just victims, but not treating people with compassion and dignity. But this bill is not a bill to provide a comprehensive, integrated approach in combating and responding to gender-based violence, or provide protection for victims of gender-based violence, or to establish a national system of support services for victims of gender-based violence, or even acknowledge gender-based violence as a public health issue. And this is not a bill to facilitate a multi-sectoral, community-based, public-private partnership in combating and responding to gender-based violence. And this is why we saw last week the powerful joint statement signed by Women United, BUYDC, Women of Strength Association, Everyone Counts Organization, Marion Bethel Sayers, Therese Turner Jones, L. Clark, Alexandra Malis Lind, Hadassah Johnson, Dr. Camille Farquharson, MD, and the Caribbean Women and Leadership. They were promised legislation to deal with offenses against women and children, particularly girls. And they have been offended by the bait and switch by the government, which ignores the tireless efforts of NGOs and stakeholders. They have discussed this bill as if it is a superhero swooping in to save the day, but it ignores the gender-based violence strategic plan developed by the previous PLP administration. The primary recommendation in that strategic plan to address gender-based violence was the Gender-Based Violence Act. How can we move forward as a country if governments are not treated as continuous? This Davis-Cooper administration is not even trying to continue the positive developments of its political predecessor, the Christie Davis administration. Yet they seem to have no problem repeating the mistakes. We are concerned about gender-based violence. There is an increase in gender-based violence. And we need specific legislation to deal with gender-based violence. This legislation does not. Bahamians deserve a bill to provide for protection of victims of gender-based violence and all connected matters. The women of this great country deserve an administration that takes them seriously, not an administration that ignores their own female experts, not an administration that dismisses without justification the work of stakeholders, many of whom are female, not an administration that does not take a woman's allegation of rape and threats of death seriously, and not an administration that does not have the testicular fortitude to protect wives from rape. Madam President, through you, I say to this administration, do better. Madam President, as I conclude, I ask that may the Lord who secures justice and rights to all the oppressed continue to bless our beautiful islands in the stream.
Thank you, Senator Barnett Ellis, for your contribution. As many?
On a point
The chair
of order.
recognizes
No, I'm not
Senator
gonna address
Honorable.
on the wrap up. I'm going
The
to
chair,
address right now.
the chair recognizes Senator Honorable Ryan Pinder.
Just to
And-
address on this is a point of order.
And what is your point of order, Senator
To
Pinder?
address certain issues that were misleading in the prior senator's communication. I didn't want to interrupt her midway through, so I'll just summarize some of these misleading. The senator spoke on lack of consultation. Consultation occurred for many, many years, way over a decade. And I personally, no, let me speak. You don't have to gawk at me. Let me speak. I personally was involved in at least 5 or 6 consultations with small groups on the drafting and evolution. And the fact of the matter is, in many of those consultations, there was a debate between the group members on whether this should be, as we went with, a protection against violence framework or gender-based violence framework. That came from the group of interested people. This isn't an executive decision by this government. That's first and foremost. Secondly, the member was very misleading with respect to her quote on the definition of violence in the 2023 bill, and especially in her conclusion, which would mislead the Bahamian people, that the definition resulted in the exclusion of gender-based violence. The definition, as read by the member, violence means violence of any sort that results in physical, sexual, or psychological violence, including rape, sexual abuse, torture, trafficking in persons, forced prostitution, kidnapping, sexual harassment, online harassment, or economic and financial abuse that A, occurs within a domestic relationship whether or not the offender shared the same household. And that's where the definition, as indicated by the member, ended. However, there is a subpart B to the definition of violence in this act. It says, is perpetrated by any person, whether in the workplace or otherwise. So the fact of the matter is the same example given by the senator
It's in there.
would be covered by this bill.
Covered by it.
Would be covered by the bill. Would be covered by a bill. The last point I want to address on misleading Madam President, is the member spoke about the powers of the minister in this bill and how it was divergent and created a political, what I would say, a political framework for what we are doing. Let me just read Section 37 of the 2016 Act, or bill. Section 37 speaks to ministerial directions. Those are directives of a minister, right? The minister may, after consultation with the board, give written directions to the authority to do or not do that which is mentioned in the directions if the minister considers it necessary to so direct in the public interest, wide bearing, to discharge or facilitate the discharge of an international obligation of the Bahamas, and give general or specific directions to the authority on the policy to be followed in carrying out or pursuit of the functions of the authority. So the minister directs the policy of the authority.
2016 bill.
In the 2016 bill,
That they support it.
right? So my only point is, government is involved in this process. In the 2016 bill, government's involved in this process.
Yes.
And in the 2023 bill, government is involved in this process. That is not a bad thing, Madam President. That is not a bad thing. But what I will not stand for is my good friend on that side intentionally misleading the Bahamian public by omissions of what is being said, when if you read the entirety, it is contrary to what she's alleging. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator the Honorable Ryan Pinder. The chair recognizes Senator the Honorable Michael Abonnet Ellis.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to deal with the first thing that the Honorable Attorney General mentioned first. Yes, it's on. When he read the definition contained in the, what he calls the 2016 bill, but could also be the 2022 bill, it says the minister may, after consultation. The bill that we are debating today omits, they've removed that consultation. The minister no longer has the need to consult with anybody before he gives directions, and that is a marked difference. And as to the point on consultation, if we look at this morning's Guardian, the church leaders have said that nobody consulted with them. And in the article about the government's amendments to the protection of the... I was just to say, he said he was in the process of consulting the Minister of Social Services. So the suggestion that there was this wide consultation is incorrect, because the public has said themselves that there were persons who were not, and persons who are usually consulted that weren't consulted. And as to the last point regarding...
Order. I need to hear the senator, please.
Thank you, Madam President. As to the last point regarding the alleged omission, the record will reflect that I read the entire definition when I was on my feet. I did read B. I read the entire definition.
You moved on until we mentioned B and then...
Prompted to.
Thank you, Senator the Honorable Michael Abonnet Ellis. As many? The chair recognizes Senator the Honorable Darren Pickstock.
Madam President, Senate colleagues, Madam President, this is indeed a spirited debate. In our gallery, I would like to acknowledge the distinguished members in our gallery and to say to you thank you for being here today. Madam President, I'm deeply humbled by this opportunity to present during this debate on this legislation. I'm even more humbled by the presence of so many distinguished and committed persons representing various organizations and implied interests who, out of their concern and advocacy, have joined us today in the gallery. I know how important and critical this issue is to you. I know of the work and the effort and research you have put in, considerations, recommendations, and discourse you have brought to this effort and agenda. I know your hearts are golden. I know your commitment and dedication is pure, patriotic, and selfless. Madam President, before I go into the bill, sometimes it strikes me, for those on the other side, Madam President, just the nature of the discourse. I recall between 2017 and 2021 that this bill laid on the table. Dormant. Okay? Please, Madam President. It was dormant. And so, Madam President, it's just disingenuous. That's all I'm trying to say. It is disingenuous for my good colleague, Senator Ellis, to be speaking of the bill as if it just appeared. This laid dormant from 2016 until the Progressive Liberal Party picked it up, Madam President. Okay? The competent authority had this bill between 2016 and 2017 and 2021, Madam President. Yeah, they have now found their voice, right? Senator Ellis says that this bill should not be political. Madam President, Senator Ellis said that this bill should not be political. Madam President, again, this is quite disingenuous because she stood up on her feet and she was passive-aggressive as to the way she dealt with this bill in the political nature that she dealt with it. So I just wanted to address that. The AG addressed the issues that I was going to address on my feet that Senator Ellis mentioned quite ably. Madam President, we meet today, as it were, in this honorable chamber against a backdrop of certainty and, to some degree, uncertainty. We meet today in these ancient halls and hollow halls where legislation has been discussed and debated over a century to deal with issues, Madam President, that are emotive and in some instances, fiercely personal, Madam President. Madam President, the learned Attorney General has very ably and in very plain language, Madam President, broken down what is the intention and benefit and substance of the Protection Against Violence Bill, very ably. And I would like at this time to stand on my feet and thank the Office of the Attorney General and all those groups involved for bringing this piece of legislation forward. Madam President, the Protection Against Violence Bill is a comprehensive piece of legislation designed to provide protection and support for victims of violence in the Bahamas. The bill not only seeks to uphold the nation's commitment under the international conventions, such as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, and the Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment, and Eradication of Violence Against Women, 1994 Convention, but also create a domestic framework for supporting victims, handling complaints, and raising public awareness. At its core, Madam President, the bill proposes the creation of the Protection Against Violence Commission and Secretariat. These bodies will coordinate various stakeholders, grant funding, as the Attorney General alluded to, and provide technical assistance to strengthen the national response to violence. The bill also prescribes sensitivity, training for law enforcement and support personnel, and includes provisions for raising public awareness on the problems of and remedies for violence against women. Moreover, Madam President, the bill defines a comprehensive set of rights for victims, including the right to compassion, dignity, confidentiality, and privacy. It establishes protocols for complaints handling by victims and details the procedures when violence results in death. Madam President, in terms of victim support, the bill commits to providing safe housing, legal, psychological, and medical assistance, and facilitating access to safe spaces and communities. It also promises readjustment and training programs to help victims reintegrate into public, private, and social life, Madam President. Madam President, overall, the Protection Against Violence Bill of 2023 is a testament to the Bahamas' dedication to eradicating violence against women and ensuring victim support, promoting public education about this pressing issue, Madam President. Madam President, we're prepared as a government to address any concern that arise. The bill is not about imposing new bureaucratic structures, but about improving response, Madam President, mechanisms, better coordinating efforts, and providing much-needed support to victims. It's an investment in the safety, dignity, and well-being, Madam President, of our citizens, Madam President. Madam President, this bill represents the government's commitment to creating a Bahamas where every individual can live free from the fear of violence. It is our pledge, Madam President, to support and uplift victims, providing them with the service and assistance they need to recover and thrive, Madam President. Madam President, I want to highlight some key provisions of the Protection Against Violence Bill 2023. Madam President, with respect to promotion and education and training, Madam President, this provision requires education and training for all involved in the justice system, including law enforcement officers and other personnel responsible for implementing policies to eradicate violence. The bill mandates the provision of specialized services for victims of violence, including shelters, counseling service, care, and custody of affected children, and more, provided by both public and private sector agencies. The bill proposes the establishment of a commission responsible for ensuring that the country's international and regional obligations related to violence are met. The commission will also be tasked with strengthening, collaborating among various stakeholders in combating violence. The minister is tasked with establishing a nonprofit foundation, as alluded to by the Attorney General, to raise funds for the use and the benefit of the commission in its functions. The bill ensures the rights of victims of violence, including the right to be treated with compassion and dignity, the right to be informed of all rights and services available to them, the right to confidentiality and right to privacy. The bill outlines comprehensively, Madam President, a comprehensive support service available to victims, including housing, psychological, medical, legal assistance, and readjustment, as I alluded to, and training programs. Madam President, I can appreciate the concerns of various groups, Madam President, who have lent their voice through media on what they term is their disappointment to the bill. I can appreciate the concerns that have been raised about the long years of work dating from 2016. that these discussions are taking place and the heavy lifting, sincerity, and focus that was brought to those meetings. I also appreciate the sentiments of some who find no fault in this legislation. Madam President, the past few weeks have taught us much about violence, taught us much. Violence is unabated in our homeland. Young men are dying thus about us every single day, shot down in cold blood, left like dogs in the streets. Our little girls, Madam President, risk going outside in the yard to play because of some despicable pervert is canvassing the community, I beg your pardon. Wives, Madam President, boys, and husbands are being violently assaulted and even killed in unyielding domestic violence. The bill before us seeks to provide a jurisprudence and reassurance of swift and compelling justice for victims, Madam President. The bill before us seeks to provide the safety net of counseling, welfare, and other supportive services, such as safe houses, as mentioned. Madam President, the bill before us sets up the protocols and frameworks for a revolutionary conceptualization, Madam President, and movement on how this nation will protect the most vulnerable and give aid and succor to victims. Yet, Madam President, as in all pieces of legislation, the work is in progress. The work is in progress, Madam President. Madam President, I will not belabor my remarks here today with with claims, rightly or wrongly, Madam President, with respect to the 2016 draft legislation. To do so would be to tread waters unnecessarily and foolishly. This is an arm of Parliament, Madam President, and Parliament has the power to amend. Parliament has the power to stop, cancel, and review. Parliament has the power to pass into law and not to pass into law, Madam President. This vital oversight arm of the Parliament has the power to send back to the other place for further instructions, relief, remedy, and clarifications, Madam President. Madam President, yet it is in my humble submission that we must de-escalate immediately, Madam President, the politicization of this bill for partisan purposes. We must not be disingenuous or passive-aggressive as to speaking to this bill, Madam President. Madam President, we are talking about our mothers.
Yes.
We are talking about our daughters, Madam President.
Yes.
Our sisters, our nieces, Madam President. Our grandmothers, our aunts, Madam President. And on the other side of things, we are also talking about our dads and our grandfathers, Madam President, our uncles, our sons, our nephews, Madam President, our male and female friends and associates must all be included, Madam President. We are talking about those persons who do not identify in the traditional gender groupings that our great grandparents knew, Madam President. We are in a Bahamas that is a participant in an evolving world of social order and enterprising human rights. The nation has today paused to pay exclusively to the concerns of our Bahamian women, Madam President. She has a right to be heard, Madam President. She does not have to demand it. She has earned a right to be heard, the unfettered right to command it, Madam President. She was born with that right. Even though we have pushed the pause button, we cannot be ostriches and ignore the other prevailing biting issues of our times which evolve, Madam President. What about the men? Young men in particular and the gang culture, Madam President, the proliferation of guns and weapons of brutal destruction, coupled with a culture of conflict, non-resolution, is creating a killing field of very young fathers and brothers, Madam President. The nation must have this frank and unrestricted conversation on the culture of rape and violence against women as a precursor to these other biting and tormenting proclivities, because we are called upon to protect our women and our children. It is our duty and obligation, Madam President. Yet tradition has been thrown to the raging winds. Madam President, these are very troubling times. These are horrific times, and I am most grateful for the organizations and the women's group who have shown their power and their resilience in letting their views be known on this bill before us, Madam President. There are some who think the constant bombardment and steady stream of violence and sexual assault against women, our women and girls, have left us immune and cold and uncaring. I submit that the advocacy that we have witnessed since this bill was tabled and passed in that other place suggests that our democracy is healthy and alive, and Bahamians take very seriously their civic duty and will not go gently, Madam President. Madam President, this is about 4-year-old Bella, Madam President. This is about the 11-year-old Marco Norwich, Madam President. This is about the 9-year-old girl in the headlines in Monday's newspaper who was abducted and molested here in Nassau on the weekend. This is about the single mother who leaves home at 5 a.m. each morning to get a bus to work so she can feed her family and pay her rent. And some pervert takes her at knife and gunpoint into the bushes and violates the Bahamian dream of personal safety, respect, dignity, and the true essence and fiber of women's existence. What about the family of Paul Melbourne, Madam President, the champion bodybuilder? What about the family of Nellie Mae Brown Cox, Madam President? The London tabloids found her murder so internationally disgusting, they put it on the front page along with the weapon with those evil words inscribed thereon. This is what cheaters get, end quote. This is about the scores of women who were the victims of young serial rapists, who is now behind bars, but was able, on a technicality, to have 3 of his convictions overturned. This is about the high school girl who was called into the principal's office to find herself assaulted by a person who the students call pastor. This is about the man who lured a young lady whose beguiled girlfriend ended her life in the parking lot of a West Bay Street former hotel property. This is about the 2 young men who turned up at A&E with multiple stab wounds they inflicted on each other in their crazed jealousy dispute. This is about the family asleep in the comfort and supposed to be security of their home to be awakened by beasts. Madam President, this is about the victims of violence. This is about human beings, Madam President. Madam President, this is not about us in this place. This is about the victims. This is about making this bill work effectively and efficiently to ease the pain, calm, and tension and get sexual and violent-prone perverts off our streets, Madam President. I fully support Senator Ellis's assertion earlier this week on the need for the nation to engage in a full and frank discussion on how we got here, how we get to the perceived culture of rape and other non-consensual sexual deviances in this nation, Madam President. Absolutely, make no mistake, Madam President, about it. This culture did not begin yesterday. It did not begin yesterday, Madam President. There is this implied inference in these table topics that this is the handiwork of the now generation, our generation. Anyone who believes this nonsense is a fool and a liar, and the truth is not within him or her. Madam President, the Black Oscar-winning actress Viola Davis, in her interview in Essence magazine, talked openly to California support groups of rape victims of her bitter experiences as a child. Ms. Davis spoke about her younger sister, only 14 at the time, being sent to a corner mom and pop shop and returning home in tears. One of the owners violated her innocence, Madam President. Ms. Davis says her mother hurried down to the shop and confronted the pervert and called the police and makes him pay for the crime with time in jail and pecuniary damages. Alas, Ms. Davis' sister never fully recovered from the vile and vicious violation of her body and ended up on drugs. Madam President, Mrs. Davis commended the women's support groups for the work they do to save and assist victims from shaming and disgrace that often accompanies their violation. Ms. Davis says in the United States, 1 of every 4 girls and 1 out of every 6 boys will suffer some form of sexual violation before they reach the age of 18. Madam President, we have to pay tribute to our Wonder Women of the Bahamas who lead and head these support groups and organizations, who is out there every day teaching, mentoring, focused and warning the public. We owe them so much. The least we can do in this place is to hear them. We may not agree, but they deserve to be heard. Madam President, in the Bahamas, we isolate rape to the reported instances of the violent sexual crimes that make the newspaper from police reports and court reportings. But I submit, Madam President, there is a far more sinister and ravenous form of rape and sexual abuse that goes unreported on almost a daily basis. There, Madam President, there is a general disgusting acceptance by many of the older generations on the conduct and behavior of some who are prolific offenders, Madam President. We hear these stories of successful children born out of wedlock, whose fathers was prominent shopkeepers over the hill, and who held down underage girls, Madam President, and raped them, sexually assaulted them, Madam President, and never saw fit to drag their worthless, good-for-nothing backside straight to jail. Madam President, it is when certain segments of the society encourage such despicable behavior, Madam President, when these sectors join in raunchy locker room talk about children, that this culture may have at its nesting, Madam President. And Madam President, the list goes on. Madam President, I make these assertions, Madam President, to implore the stakeholders that our scope and your scope is so large that I don't think it has been fathomed the depth and length of this depravity, Madam President. Many citizens listening to this debate today will be familiar with Women Against Rape, WAR, the forerunner in the early 1970s to advocate for Bahamian women for protection from sexual abuse and seeking to have autonomy and dignity for women victims protected. My research shows that in this period, just as it is today, there was a disconcerting escalation in rape and violent sexual attacks. War rallied and got the attention of the nation when the government of the day decided to remove the cat o' nine tail as a form of punishment under the penal code. Women rallied in protest. Once again, in a deepening democracy, people listened, and it was generally agreed that any form of torture from the Middle Ages and is reminiscent of our dark history of slavery should be removed from our penal code. Madam President, this bill seeks to explore and promote education on protection against sexual violence. I am of the opinion that such classes should be taught in our schools. Boys and girls can be taught about protocols of relationships and dating and the laws as it relates to sexual acts. And they can also be taught, Madam President, how to respect their bodies and their decisions and know how to respect the word no, N-O, and the punishment for sexual misbehavior. I would also hasten to suggest that such classes not be governed by any religious dissertation without the consent of the parents. Madam President, I was on Carmichael Road. I was in the Carmichael Road area 2 months ago, and I was shocked to see primary school children hanging out outside the school gate after 5 p.m., waiting on a parent to come and collect them. That can't be right, Madam President. This perpetuates our problem, Madam President. The schools should be a system where children wait to be collected by their parents or their guardians. Speaking about the need to teach children about relationship behaviors, Madam President, children should have it drummed into their psyche that you do not get into the car of a stranger. You do not even walk up or acknowledge a stranger who may be beckoning you from a vehicle. Parents who leave their children unattended in empty school campuses should face consequences, Madam President. This is perpetuating a problem, Madam President. These are the infomercials we should hear on radio and television. I know that Social Services Minister Obi Wilshcombe and State Minister Lisa Ramming are genuine and transparent in what this bill is seeking to do, Madam President. These ministers have listened to the experts, the experienced social workers, and experts in private practice. They have listened to stakeholders and have circulated the bill for discussion before it was tabled in the House. Madam President, that being said, it is my opinion that the government's doors are still wide open for consultation and discussion. That's what we do in these hollow halls, Madam President. Madam President, I humbly suggest that every stakeholder should respect the rights, interests, and advice of their community. This national dilemma cannot fail because of any agenda other than that of the Bahamian people, Madam President. Madam President, there is suffering, hurt, and pain out there by the bucketful, and there is no time to pause to soothe personality, conflicts, or controversial agendas, Madam President. Madam President, I would also like to humbly advise that total deference has to be paid to the Bahamian people. Just because the world is doing it doesn't mean the Bahamas and the Bahamian people want to do it. History will tell us what happens at the voters' box on 3 referendums over the last 20 years. Such referenda, which were also aligned with treaty obligations and concurrences, which the Bahamian people voters said a classic and echoing crescendo of no. The governed will not be tolerant of any autocratic imposition of any issues to which there is no agreement, and further, there is no clarion call in the wider society to have and to see any such issues dealt with, Madam President. Madam President, we live in an ultra-modern society and a modern era. Bahamians are well-traveled, well-heeled, and well-informed. But this is still the Bahamas, and the Bahamian people will have it their way, Madam President. Last year, the religious community went ballistics when the media reported the suggestion from an organization for the legalization of sex workers in the country. This suggestion has put forward during similar discussions with the Ministry of Social Services. Madam President, I would like to table a copy of this report in the Nassau Guardian, in which the pastor of Bahamas Faith Ministries and other objected to the suggestion of prostitution being a lawful enterprise in this country. Madam President, and I would like to quote from this article which I would lay. On the issue, the government should not consider a recommendation from the National Gender-Based Violence Discriminatory Law Review Forum to decriminalize prostitution, Bahamas Faith Ministry Senior Pastor Dave Burrows said yesterday. On the issue of prostitution, I must begin by stating that I am and will always be for the promotion of values and virtues that enhance life rather than vices that contradict decent living, Burrows said when reached for comment. Prostitution, in my mind, is a dehumanizing and a degrading activity and a vice that should not be incentivized by decriminalization or legalization. Prostitution is fraught with criminal and health issues which do not go away with decriminalization. I rest that right there. Make no mistake about it, we need to hear more from the persons who made suggestions as to what research they can present which will help us in this national debate on the culture of rape in this country.
President, I thank the senator for yielding. I think this is a convenient time to suspend for lunch. I move that the business of the Senate be suspended until 3 p.m. this afternoon.
Is there a seconder? Second. It has been moved and seconded that the business of the Senate is suspended until 3 p.m. this afternoon. As many hours in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. The ayes have it. The motion is carried. Order the business of the Senate is suspended until 3 p.m. this afternoon.